Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude, featuring ethnic studies, our topic. And to discuss this, we have three professors from ethnic studies. The chair of Department of Ethnic Studies, Monisha Gupta, Davianna McGregor, she's a professor there, and also Tengan, professor in ethnic studies and also in anthropology. So thank you very much, and you are also in women's studies as well. Okay, so featuring ethnic studies. Okay, we are all in ethnic studies, and wanted to just like figure out, as an introduction, how did we come about, to be in ethnic studies first, and then what does ethnic studies mean to you? Like, why didn't you go to somewhere else instead of ethnic studies, for example? Well, we start with Monisha. You're the chair.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I came to the University of Hawaii in 2002, and I feel extraordinarily privileged to have been received in ethnic studies and to have worked here for the last 15 years. I feel that I've come home in terms of my commitment to social justice and my research and activism in social movements. I feel that there is no better home than ethnic studies for this. And having been away for about a semester in other institutional contexts, I realized that our department, in forwarding its foundational mission of doing community engaged work and community relevant work, is really unique to our department. So we are not suffering from the tortuous debates around, how do we reconcile our scholarship with activism? I think there is an organic link that is institutionally supported by this department. And we also nurture our students to have that same commitment to social justice. And we really turn them on to, how to think about alternatives or how to center, their own desires in terms of working for a better future in the middle of the Pacific.
All right, wonderful. Davianna, you're the longest of us all, in ethnic studies. So you have seen these developments that happened. So could you say something about that? And also, you are also now the director of the Center for Oral History that used to be with ethnic studies and left, and now it's back. So could you say also something about the Center for Oral History in your narration?
Okay, well, I guess I got involved with ethnic studies actually as a student when it was this program, an experimental program at the time, and the university decided that they no longer wanted to offer the courses that were being offered through the department, or the program rather. So they were going to dissolve it, and the students and faculty and the community organized to demand that we continue the program. And so that was like in 1970s. And after that, I completed my work in history and was brought into the department actually as an undergraduate still, or as a graduate student with an MA only, and then continued my my studies as at one point I was also the acting director to take the program over a rough hump and reorganize and refocus until we were able to get a full-time director who had could be on a tenure track, which was Dr. Franklin Aoude. So after that, we, most of us were also completing our studies, and we completed that and got the resources through supporters in the legislature to be able to compete for full-time positions within the department and to grow the program into a full-time department. And so we're able to accomplish that. And now we're at a stage where the first generation of scholars who founded the program are, looking toward the retirement within the next decade. And so, we're lucky that we've been able to recruit new faculty who are as committed both to teaching ethnic studies, but also connecting our students to the community and to give back to the community. Through scholarship as well as service. So the Center for Oral History is really an ideal addition to our department because, linking our history from our kupuna and all those who led the way and pioneered working for social justice in our islands, it's very important to document that history, to pass it on to the next generation of our students. And it's really matches our curriculum. So by bringing in the center, at this time we're trying to see how we can involve our students and faculty, not only in ethnic studies, but also in the College of Social Sciences in various projects, and to relaunch the program, make the 800 interviews that we have collected and which are available in Scholar Space more accessible to the community, maybe through podcasts and digital storytelling, making it accessible through the web, and just repackaging it to make it a more vital part of our lives.
Yeah, wonderful, yeah. And Ty, one of the new generation, so to speak. There were others after him, but compared to us, for instance, he's the new generation. So Ty, could you say something about your relationship with ethnic studies? And we can talk about the field school by way of introduction, and then we can deal with it at a longer period of time.
Yeah, sure. Well, mahalo again for creating this opportunity for us to talk about ethnic studies. For me, I went away from my undergraduate and I came back for my MA and PhD here in the Department of Anthropology. And I was always interested in issues of Hawaiian identity, so familiar with the work of Davianna, others like Mary and Kelly, who I also got to be in contact with as a graduate student. And as I was finishing my PhD, this position became available, which was in fact to, I can't say replace Marion, but to succeed her in some way. I felt very fortunate to have gotten that position and to join the department. My own practice and conceptualization of anthropology was always a little bit more on the activist side, so there was a nice fit there, and trying to root it within the community, and especially for the Native Hawaiian community. And it's been a really important place to develop the critical perspectives I've come to take from ethnic studies, especially a sharper analysis of race and class, in addition to ethnicity, culture, and indigeneity, which I had already been thinking about. And at this point now, sort of, I guess, mid-career, looking to connect, especially with the Aina and land-based issues that have become so central also for our new directions in Oceanic Ethnic Studies, and building off of what Davianna said, thinking of how oral histories and ethnographies can be a part of the skill sets that we give to our students, but also the research we can provide to our communities. And I was fortunate to, with my colleague Jim Bayman in anthropology, back in 2013, to have gotten a grant from Kamehameha Schools to run an archaeological field school, which ran for 5 years out in Waialua on the North Shore. And this year we were able to transition it. So it's primarily myself as the primary principal investigator, and it's an oral history field school working with the community out there, and it dovetails nicely with the return of the Center for Oral History to us, since it was actually there that the oral history program that was part of ethnic studies first completed their first major oral history project out in Waialua and Haleiwa. So it sort of comes full circle nicely.
Yeah, right. Good. We'll talk more about the field school and the Center for Oral History and so on. But also I wanted to play a segment from an interview with Dr. Rod Labrador, whom we recruited after you. So he's like a newer faculty member who's been doing tremendous work for ethnic studies. So we played this interview. I asked him about his research, etc., and how it fits with ethnic studies and so forth. So we'll watch that, and then we can talk about our own research as well.
So if you take these two together, This, I think, represents like 2 of 3 books written about Filipinos in Hawaii. Wow. And so what I've been trying to do is create an archive. And so Theo and I were looking at how do we talk about the community. So this was more kind of a historical approach, looking at photos, using that as a way to talk about history, talk about issues. And then my own book was based on ethnography, was based on kind of analysis of performances and things, since I'm an anthropologist by training, using more kind of contemporary, looking at more contemporary issues and things. I guess one of the chapters that a lot of people read, and one of the things that people have used my work is the stuff I've written on ethnic humor, on local ethnic humor, and kind of situating ethnic humor within the context of multicultural discourse in Hawaii, within the context of looking at broader issues of representation, looking at the linguistic construction of this, what I call mock Filipino, which is this speaking English with this quote-unquote Filipino, heavy Filipino accent, right? But doing kind of a linguistic anthropology treatment of that, and looking at the way that jokes perform or participate in this system of representation in Hawaii that buys into multiculturalism, but also disguises inequities, it disguises power differences in Hawaii.
Yeah, so this like fits right smack into what ethnic studies does,
yes.
right?
Yeah, so I think in terms of ethnic studies, these projects was trying to do something more community-based, our work in the community as ethnic studies, that's an important piece. So even though Theo and I were both at the university, it was important for us to get community involvement in the work that we were doing. And this really looking at questions around power and representation, looking at where does things like political economy, where do issues around class, where do issues around language fit into it. And so in terms of ethnic studies, these are really kinds of important interventions that we're making in our department.
Yeah, in fact, we were fortunate to recruit Rod for this position to succeed Dean Alegado, who was like, the Filipino specialist, and he's done tremendous work in that vein. So we have now that covered as well. So that's good. So I want to ask you, like Monisha, about your own research and how it fits in ethnic studies, and then we can talk more about that.
Sure. My research has been on social movements that are immigrant-led. And I think that, in many ways, when I first came to the department, because I worked on labor organizing, women's organizing, and queer organizing, it was very well received in the department as something that fit into the department's focus on racial and gender justice.
Yeah,
and
your book, Unruly Immigrants.
Yeah, so, my book, Unruly Immigrants, the major intervention there in the field, because I've come trained as a sociologist, was that, as ethnic subjects, we are not just, the main questions that we can ask about our communities is not just about whether we are being able to perpetuate our cultures, whether we are being able to sort of keep some of these practices, homeland practices alive in the diaspora, but I situated them as political subjects, as people who are taking on big questions around racism, around immigration, around imperialism, around neoliberalism, law and order, and kind of shifted the kinds of questions that we can ask, at least at that time in the field of the South Asian diaspora in the United States. So I've continued to build on that work, and I feel that has a really great articulation with what the rest of my colleagues are doing. I learn every day from the ways in which we can talk about various sorts of conflicts that manifest themselves in the form of ethnic conflicts, but underlying that are various other power structures such as imperialism, such as the United States increasing role as the national security police of the world, then that then gets played out on the bodies of migrants in terms of deportation policies, which is what my new research is about. I feel that our department is, particularly well positioned to think about social movements and political actors that come from our communities, and then in that sense influence policy and shift the ways in which we can think about migrant communities, especially because that's my specialty.
Yeah, in fact, we have a course on the books, Ethnic Studies 381, Social Movements in Hawaii, and and in the U.S. and so on. So that's a good one to actually teach as well. So, Davy, could you tell us about your book and then your other research?
Well, I guess in 2007 I published my work, which was partly out of my dissertation, but a lot based on my work in communities working to provide stewardship for our lands and resources, but documenting where are our important cultural and natural resources, especially for subsistence practices in our rural communities that I call cultural kipuka in my book. And to understand these cultural kipuka have been really important in perpetuating Native Hawaiian cultural beliefs and customs and practices. And it's all because people in these rural areas are really still reliant on resources for fishing, hunting, gathering, and that requires continuing to apply the knowledge, the ancestral knowledge about how these resources are impacted by seasonal changes, and therefore the cultural knowledge of our ancestors has continued to inform them how to be successful farmers and fishers. So the book looks at Molokai and Hana and Waipio Valley and Puna, and then looking at how these cultural kipuka, the kuaina from these areas, the people who are the people who are longtime residents, came together and also helped in the revival of cultural customs and practices on the island of Kaho'olawe, especially Uncle Harry Mitchell from Kenai, Wailua Nui on Maui, and Auntie Edith Kanakaole from Hawaii Island, and the Kupuna on Molokai. My more recent book, which is being reviewed, and I've heard it's too long, is a joint effort with Professor Melanie McKenzie from the UH Law School. And we've written a book documenting the long history of Native Hawaiian governance of Hawaii.
Is there a final title for that one?
It's in Hawaiian.
Like a working title.
It talks about Native Hawaiian self-governance. I mean governance, and it's in Hawaiian, so it's Eo Kalahui. Oiwi, Lahui. So, but looking at from the early origins of the rise of district chiefs, we call the Ali'ai Moku in each district, and tracing their, then forming Aha, Ali'i on each island, and then having paramount chiefs or mo'i for each of the 4 major districts. And then that transition into a monarchy, and then the continued assertion of Native Hawaiian governance throughout the territorial period through various organizations, and even the establishment of the Hawaiian Homes Commission, and then looking at the reassertion, especially of Native Hawaiian governance, and working on that. So that's being under review, and I'm also recently been doing work to look at who were the original inhabitants of Kalaupapa prior to it being established as a place to isolate leprosy patients, and what was their way of life, and then also looking at the process of their eviction from the Kalaupapa, Waihanau, Waikolu, and Nihoa to make way for the settlement there.
Yeah, well, wonderful. Before we go to you, Tai, I interviewed also a more recent hire in ethnic studies, Ethan Caldwell, and interesting his background and his work. So we will watch that, and then we come back to you, Tai.
And did most of my graduate schooling in Chicago at Northwestern University's African American Studies program. And actually, what brought me here to Hawaii was mainly where this Department of Ethnic Studies is situated, not only within the Pacific, but also in terms of where it's going in terms of the direction as well. And I think the fact that it has an oceanic focus speaks volumes to how interconnected the work that I do on U.S. militarism and African Americans in the Pacific, as well as the African diaspora in the Pacific, can lend itself to. So just a little bit about my work. I work on looking at soldier-civilian relations, and more specifically, how do conceptions of race, gender, and nation change as we move beyond the continental United States. So I focus predominantly on the military context. Most of my research in the past for my dissertation and the upcoming book project is focused on Okinawa, or more specifically, African-American soldiers in Okinawa and the kind of relations that they have with Okinawan citizens from the 1940s post-war to the contemporary period. And so I look at that through a combination of visual archive analysis, ethnography, and also cultural production.
Okay, so we're gonna play another one from Rod's interview because he's talking about Oceanic Ethnic Studies, which like Ty has mentioned, and then we go to Ty in terms of talking more about his projects and the Oceanic Ethnic Studies as well.
Something to look forward to is the idea of Oceanic Ethnic Studies that we're developing in the department. And I think our department's in the forefront of creating and building this idea of how can we reimagine ethnic studies and reimagine it within the context of broader Oceania, looking at different kind of theoretical frameworks, looking at different ways of doing research, and using things like going out into the community as legitimate forms of data collection, and but really and community engagement, right? And so the idea for us as a department is we're going to build this idea of Oceanic Ethnic Studies, and we're working with our students amongst our faculty and really kind of create this new field, newish field, I guess. And hopefully it'll lead to things like having a master's program and eventually a graduate program, because I think with our students there's a huge interest in the kinds of work that we're doing in our department. Students are really interested in the history of community involvement, the political, the involvement of our faculty like you in our political movements, the social political movements in the last several decades and continuing on, right, and the kinds of work that we're doing out in the community. Students are really interested in that, but they're also really kind of interested in what are we thinking theoretically? What are the kinds of ways that we can rethink how we do ethnic studies, right? And then what does that mean in terms of how does that help us to kind of reimagine a more just and a more peaceful society?
Yeah, Ty, I remember like when you were chair before Monisha, we had like a conference, like Oceanic Ethnic Studies conference. So could you talk about this and in terms of your research, like the field school, for instance, and so on, and how it relates to that concept that you mentioned earlier and Rod talked about it as well?
Right. So that conference that we held, was it 2015, I think?
Yeah, 2015, in March,
and,
I think, yeah.
You know, it was a really nice opportunity for us to kind of bring together. I think it is naturally, I think, converging in the direction that we ended up articulating it explicitly as an Oceanic Ethnic Studies. A project is both an intellectual and an activist project rooted in our places of the Pacific, but also in cultures and ways of thinking about connection through oceans, and how that informs the work that I think a lot of us were doing in different ways. For my own projects, I had been thinking about it from a slightly different but related frame of Native Pacific studies, coming from a different conference I had been involved with back in 2000 at Santa Cruz with colleagues of ours that many of us are familiar with. Vince Diaz and Kehaulani Kawanui were the organizers of that. But many others that were trying to think of how we can use Native Pacific culture in our research and as an important analytical frame that looks at all these connections and the breadth of travel that oceanic peoples have accomplished in terms of spreading across the Pacific, but also maintaining deep roots in their culture, and how does that become something you take with you in these different places?
Yeah, like you have your previous book, Native Men Remade, which we talked about on this show, by the way. So just like we talked about your book as well and yours. But anyway, so could you say something in its relationship and then like the field school that's happening now in terms of that concept of Oceanic Ethnic Studies?
Sure. So for my book, Native Men Remade, which was an ethnography of a Hawaiian men's group on Maui that was working to reclaim warrior traditions within the broader context of the Hawaiian movement and asserting Hawaiian culture and identity, and in particular Hawaiian masculinity, which was sort of seen generally as missing within the Hawaiian movement. There was this big question, where are the men? And usually the answer was, oh, they're in prison, or if they're not in prison, they're just too busy working to be involved in decolonization movements. And that's a simplified characterization, but that's sort of how it was in the 90s, especially when I was embarking on my what was first my dissertation fieldwork that became the book. And again, it was at this time I was trying to think of our own Hawaiian and Oiwi ways of thinking about identity and culture, and the ways in which these traditions are being brought back and transformed in the present. So that became an organizing frame of thinking about how these new traditions of warriorhood were being expressed as also this new assertion of national identity and Hawaiian sovereignty. And this then kind of informed my later questions for my next work, which is looking at Native Hawaiian veterans, and especially, if, Hawaiian men are absent in certain realms, or are they more present? And that often tends to be the military, and these questions of what notions of Hawaiian masculinity versus American soldiering are being kind of articulated, kind of put together there and changed, are things that I was looking at. And it's a different kind of space to try to think, but it's, I think, also a really important one to try to understand what are these oceanic ways of understanding institutions such as the military in order to really better transform them. For the field school, this grew out of, again, an interest to connect with community, in particular with Kamehameha schools, and in our anthropology department at first to support our applied archaeology program. And then, as I said, it is kind of shifted now to thinking about how can we do more community-based research and train students in things like oral history, and also still thinking about this place of Hawaii within Oceania. Waialua is a really important place. There's a deep history that connects it to longer voyages and travels of the first peoples that came to these islands and settled here. So knowing that, as well as the later histories heavily dominated by sugar especially, and now the shift away from sugar as these communities are looking at changes with suburban sprawls, with other kinds of changes, tourism being the main thing, surf, and how are all these changing the nature of community?
We will show pictures as well, after, a little bit after, but I was talking about sugar, like this bitter experience of sugar in Hawaii, plantation and all of that. So, but what we have been talking about in one way or another is like, Oceanic Ethnic Studies, which tells us like it's global, So would you say something about the relationship between the local, the oceanic, and the global in terms, of your research, like immigrants and all of that?
Yeah, one of the things that has been really exciting about being part of ethnic studies during this period is that as newer faculty with our new research interests have come on board, we have done a lot of self-conscious searching as to, what would hold us together? How would we as a department present a coherent teaching and research agenda? And I think that is the culmination of that was the Oceanic Ethnic Studies conference, and then the curricular changes that we introduced coming out of that. So it was a very self-conscious, thoughtful, and engaged process, because the conference drew as many as 1,000 students, community members, and faculty. And what is really exciting in terms of what Rod and all of you have said is that we're really trying to think about how to do ethnic studies differently once we put the Pacific, the Oceania, Moana Nui in the middle, because that is where we are situated. And what would it mean to think about the Pacific not only as a space where U.S. power intensely operates, but from the space of self-determination of oceanic people. So that will transform the kinds of classic questions that we have asked in ethnic studies toward a decolonial, decolonizing vision that is not entirely interpolated by U.S. power and racialized the models of racial formation. I find that the most interesting part of the intellectual political project that we are engaged in as a department. I have also felt, as the first feminist to have started working in the department, that the department was extraordinarily open, which is not always the experience of many of my colleagues in ethnic studies departments, to those analyses of gender and sexuality. I feel that, Davianna, for example, was immediately open to transforming our 101 syllabus to introduce these questions to our students, to the extent that today it has become intersectionality, the consideration of race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, has become sort of bread and butter in terms of, the frameworks that we want our students to carry. These are extraordinary, intellectual developments in the field of ethnic studies that I feel that we are leading in our department.
So on that, I interviewed the most recent hire in ethnic studies, Laurel May Singh, and I asked her about her background and her research. So we will watch that, and then maybe we'll watch another segment from another person, and then we go.
First of all, I'm born and raised in Hawaii, grew up next to Diamond Head, so Hawaii is home for me, so I wanted to start off by saying that. And currently I'm writing a book, so that's what I'm doing for my postdoc, and that's what I'll be continuing when I come here to UH in Ethnic Studies. So the book develops a history of military fences and in Hawaii, and the relationship to Hawaiian struggles for self-determination, for environmental justice. And the history that I'm interested in is my project is a history of the present. So that means I went into the community of Waianae. The book is about Waianae. And I spoke to a lot of people. I lived there. I worked in the community. I engaged in community organizing. And a lot of the people that I spoke with looked to World War II as a critical turning point. So the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and particularly the martial law that followed. So the U.S. military and kind of took over. They basically ran all of Hawaii for a good 3 years during that period. And when I looked kind of back at the historical data, what I found, and particularly Marion Kelly's report, she's a retired professor from ethnic studies here. So I see myself as kind of following her footsteps. She really laid the groundwork for a lot of my research. So she has a report about Makua Valley in Waianae, which is now a military base. And the U.S. military took it over a couple days after the Pearl Harbor bombing. And the way people described kind of the changes that followed Pearl Harbor bombing was just the construction of fences everywhere. And that theme seemed to come up throughout my ethnographic research from people living in Waianae is, we can't enter our land because they're surrounded by military fences. Or even the houseless community at the boat harbor, we're kind of corralled into this enclosed space here because there's nowhere else where we can live. So that's the theme of my book, and I'm kind of looking at the history of these fences and how they've evolved and how they are accomplishing very similar things that they did during a time of martial law. And I'm kind of understand it, and the people in Waianae also understand it as an environmental justice issue. So the fences are kind of shaping their access to resources and preventing access to lifeways and livelihoods for the predominantly Hawaiian and Pacific Islander and also predominantly poor and working class community out there. And kind of in response to this fencing, they have all these really vibrant, exciting community projects there where they're reclaiming the water for the lo'i, you know, to feed the taro again, or even at the boat harbor, they kind of share their resources and live interdependently so that they can support each other to live and survive and kind of live communally.
Yeah, so like Davianna, I mean, we've heard and we watched all these, interviews and what we talked about here. So you have a lot, in terms of to look for, in terms of Center for Oral Histories, all kinds of oral histories and so on. Well, could you say something more about that?
Well, so we're relaunching the center, and one project we have is to work with the Limu Hui. They are a organization of Limu gatherers from all the islands, and several of them are kupuna, and within the last year, they've lost about 2 of their members. So they're very anxious and sincere about trying to interview all of the kupuna who are part of the Limu Hui and to document their stories and their ike, and part of it on site, if they'll show us and talk about their efforts to use limu, but also to propagate limu in the different areas. What are the changes that are impacting the abundance of limu, and how limu is also an indicator for different climate changes that we are experiencing. So the other project is with Colin Moore and Gerald Kato, Colin from Public Administration and Gerald from School of Communications, and they are very much interested in doing an oral history of the 1978 Constitutional Convention, since it's 40 years since the convention was held, and because our people will have again on the ballot in November, the question is if we should have another constitutional convention. So those oral histories could help document what was important about the 1978 Constitutional Convention, what were precedents that were set, what are areas that possibly need adjustment. Do we really need a con in 2018? Right. Those are all questions that can be explored. Yeah. And then we're wanting to invite our supporters and donors over the years to also come up with other ideas that they want to have. We want to involve our students in doing oral histories of their families and their communities, and see where that interest might lead us.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. So this leads me to talking about one interview with Kyle Kajahiro, one of our GAs, graduate assistants, and he talks about service learning. And he's been an activist for a long time, even before he came into ethnic studies as a GA. So we'll watch that, and then we'll probably watch another student also.
Service learning programs is about giving students, the opportunity to have that kind of hands-on experience and engage with real communities. So it can be anything from the Malama Ina Ahupua'a program, for example, was begun way back when Marion Kelly was here, and she had extensive contacts with many communities in Hawaii, Native Hawaiian communities, dealing with cultural preservation, environmental preservation and restoration, and they often needed help to maintain those sites. And so the idea was to link students to actual sites where people were doing this work, to learn about the history and the culture, but also to participate in sustaining those as kipuka, as these little oases of a different kind of alternative, right, or of an oasis of traditional knowledge. And so we call it Mina, Malama Ina Ahupua'a, and so we have now dozens of sites that we can place students in, where they would get hands-on experience from the Mauka sites, the sites towards the mountain, to the lowland sites where often like taro fields and food production, to the sea where we're working with fish ponds, invasive limu removal, things like that. And so they get the experience of the whole ahupua'a system, right, from Mauka to Makai.
We want to watch another one for a student, I think she's a freshman, Ihilani Lasconia. So she's eloquent. I mean, we should have more of students like her, yeah.
I am from Kane'ohe and Waimanalo in the Moku, or the island of Oahu. I'm currently a freshman. I just declared ethnic studies a couple weeks ago. And my involvement with ethnic studies started a lot before I declared. I was invested in the Ethnic Studies Student Association, and what led me to declare was Professor Rod taking his ES 101 class. One of the biggest things I've learned through Professor Rod in ethnic studies was race as a social construct and not something that's biological or genetic at all, because we're raised in a society where we believe all these preconceived ideas that people are a certain way because of their genetics, or people think a certain way or act a certain way, not because who they are as an individual or the ethnicity, but because of their biological structure. So that was a major turning point, and it made me think about what else do I not know in the realm of ethnic studies, and what I've learned in ethnic studies has really changed the way I see the world. ESSA is probably my favorite on-campus activity out of all the things I'm invested in. One of the recent things we've done is we participated in the Martin Luther King Peace March, where everyone came together, we made our own signs, and we walked representing the university, but specifically ESSA. Something that I like about the ESSA community is that we don't stay together. We're not a group that just meets together every single week, but we're a group that does life together. We eat together, we study together, and we try to integrate ourselves into other communities as well to spread what ESSA has taught us. It took me a long time to declare, one, because I'm slow with paperwork, but two, I really wanted to make sure that this is something I wanted to pursue wholeheartedly. Because I didn't want to take these lateral steps and then find out that this isn't what I'm passionate about. But being undeclared in the first semester really helped me solidify my decision. And something about ESSA is that there's a place for everyone. And I think that's something that's unique to different majors, because you sort of have to fit this profile or way of thinking if you're in other majors like travel industry management or other STEM. But ethnic studies is a place that I love because you can come forward to the table, everyone is different, and you can challenge ideas. And that's something that's not really accepted in other majors. So that's something I really like about ESSA.
Yeah, so it's just, ethnic studies as a safe place for learning, and she's very eloquent, actually. I interviewed other students as well, but we have so many interviews, so we're gonna do another featuring ethnic studies too, in March. We have more of those things. So Ty, we wanted to ask you about the field school in particular, and then if you can walk us through some of the activities, and we will watch some photos that you have.
Sure. I can speak with the photos on if we want to bring them up.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so these are a few photos that were taken by one of our majors, Makoa Freitas. And the project really started for us last fall, and it was a team of 4 of us, myself. This is a group we're consulting with, the Waialua Hawaiian Civic Club. Malia Evans, who's got the flower in the ear on the right-hand side, is a member of the Civic Club, but also a graduate of our applied archaeology program with her master's, and a community historian. So much of it was explaining the project and trying to solicit input from the Civic Club members and what they wanted to know about the history of Waialua, of that whole district, not only Waialua town, but really thinking about that whole area from Kaena going out all the way to Waimea. The big concern was the impact of change, developments. There was a number of recent battles that they'd been involved with as a civic club with regards to offshore development of windmills off of Kaena Point, one of the places that, in fact, Laurel is studying, to various housing developments that were planned either within Mokuleia on old farmland or ranch lands, and then also within Haleiwa on old taro lands. So all of these pressures were things that led us to really put together the field school and ask these kinds of questions from the families. You know, what are these older histories? What's important about Waialua, and to maintain and preserve, and again, both a Hawaiian place as well as a multicultural, multi-ethnic place. So we started off the field school. This is a picture of, we have about 17 students. We did a Huakaia field trip to really place them within the longer history, telling some of the older Mo'olelo in history. We had John Clark, who's a local historian and author, come share with us. And one of the community members, Moki Labra, who's been a long time participant in our field school and has continued his involvement here, you know, taking them, showing them maps of different places that are important historically, and going to these places and talking about these histories. Jesse Steffen is the photographer for these images. He's someone we're collaborating with to create, as Davianna was mentioning, digital storytelling. We're going to work with him to try to put together a story map, which allows for the integration of the oral histories with the images. Again, in collaboration also with Kamehameha Schools. This is one of the archaeologists there on staff who was taking us to a tour of Kupopolo, where we actually first started our archaeology field school with the students. And just last week, we worked with Kepa Mali and Winona Mali, two very prominent oral historians who are on Lanai right now, and did a workshop showing the students how it is that one conducts these oral histories. What are the certain tips you have in interviewing? And next week, we'll actually start our interviews with the community.
Very good. So I want to go to another interview with Professor John Okamura from Ethnic Studies as well. And he's talking about the courses he's teaching and his research, and especially one kind of study he did for the Teachers Union, I guess. So we will watch that.
I teach a course on race and ethnicity in Hawaii and another course on ethnic identity. So last summer, a study I did for the Hawaii State Teachers Association Union was published. It's titled Unequal Opportunity, Ethnic Inequality in Public Education in Hawaii. And it represents a kind of an update since the publication of my book on ethnicity and inequality in Hawaii from, say, 2007 to 2016, a 10-year period in which I relate some of the problems in the public school system to similar problems in the University of Hawaii system, especially having to do with the underfunding in both sectors of public education. So the underfunding from the state legislature in the K-12 schools results in the problems regarding the inadequate education being provided to public school students. And I emphasize 70% of those students are from minority groups, and the largest of which would be Native Hawaiians and Filipinos. So the underfunding results in the teacher shortage, which has been a long-term problem in the DOE schools. It results in the hiring each year of emergency hire teachers who have no experience, who have no degree, let's start with that, in education, and no experience teaching in our public schools. But nonetheless, for quite some time now, the DOE falls back on these teachers who just have a bachelor's degree in whatever subject, and that may not be the subject they teach. And so that unequal opportunity, or let's call it unequal educational opportunity provided to public school students, I think results in their underrepresentation of Filipino, Hawaiian, other Asian Pacific Islander students at Mānoa. So in my study, what I identified already was 5 consecutive years of enrollment declines at Mānoa. Because the legislature doesn't provide sufficient funding to the university has had to resort to raising tuition. And this has had a very negative impact on enrollment, especially students from Hawaii residents. And for the first time in 17 years, last fall or this academic year, tuition will not be raised because of the persisting enrollment declines.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting what he's talking about and his research and so on. Monisha, would you like to say something about ethnic studies as we are putting on the website for ethnic studies? So hopefully they can have the website on. So our history, our way, and all of these things that we can talk about in terms of courses and so on.
Yeah, you know, the first thing that I want to emphasize that sprang out at me is that, of course, you know, all our research is, you know, strong and relevant. But our source of inspiration and our everyday commitment comes from our students. I think that each and every one of us in ethnic studies models for each other how our relationship to those students should be. You know, it's always filled with aloha and always filled with a receptivity to where our students are. It doesn't matter whether they are our ethnic studies majors or our certificate students. You know, we reach out to students regardless of what discipline or what their major is. And I think that that is what convinces them that this is a good home for our students. Over the years, I have been very lucky to have witnessed the growth of many of our ethnic studies students who have gone on to pursue careers in law, in the nonprofit sector, as teachers. These are things that we want our students to do, and I feel that we've been very successful in that, nurturing our students and giving them that self-confidence, the voice, the ability to go out there and change the world. So I think that that is sort of at the heart of our department. That is a central commitment that all of us share, and we teach each other. Our new hires, I think, are remarkable teachers as well as being remarkable researchers. And, you know, again, to go back to the institutional incentives and the professionalization of ethnic studies, you know, increasingly, you know, being a good teacher is no longer rewarded, but I think that in our department, that is front and center, and that is done through service learning, that is done in our classroom, that is done, you know, through Nako Oko, which is, you know, hands-on sort of engagement with the land and the ocean, with the field schools, and with Davianna's field trips to Kaho'olawe. These are just extraordinary experiences that our students themselves, you know, put across to us this way. So I would say that that's the heart of our department.
And I want to say, like, the link is ethnicstudies.manoa.hawaii.edu. And I'm going to click on the ES class descriptions. And Davianna, would you want to say something about your courses that, you know, economic change and Hawaii's people, Hawaiians?
Well, I think, you know,
we have like 1 minute left.
There's a lot of interest in sustainability and resilience, and how can our students be prepared for the challenges, especially with climate change. And so I think we've been, in our courses, have been teaching about these issues and engaging with the community to see how can we plan for our future that is sustainable. And one of the goals of our department is to have our students become compassionate leaders in our society, as well as compassionate and knowledgeable stewards of the land. And that's one of the basic ethics that we teach our students is, you know, to be aware of the land. We live on islands that have finite resources. We have to plan to live on islands sustainably, and we have to, you know, in that process, provide for the living needs of our communities, be they living on subsistence or wage earners, or people who unfortunately can't have a house. How do we begin to provide for our communities to live on our islands?
Yeah. Good. So, Tai, would you like to say, we have like a few more minutes actually, yeah. Would you like to say something about your courses that you're teaching?
Sure. At the moment I'm doing the field school. Monisha made mention of another program, the Nako Oko Hawaiian Leadership Program, which alternates between myself and Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua, who teaches the program in political science, as she's doing this semester. But the following spring, next spring, 2019, I'll be doing it. It's a 2-course series that really focuses on connecting students with communities and with the land in order to develop a model of leadership in the vein of the ko'oko'o, which is in Hawaiian is the walking stick or the staff. So that image there is one of support and lending support to communities, and that's how one learns leadership and service, and also being connected and grounded in the land. And we had just a wonderful experience going to Koho'olawe, Kanaloa, with Davianna and the Protect Koho'olawe Ohana, which really brought the students together as a group and led to many of them after the program. It's a 2-course program, but after the program, a number of them going on to graduate school and otherwise learning to find their place as young leaders in the community. So that's it's a really important opportunity that I hope to also continue with.
Yeah, and I want to say, like, we have like a BA program, and we have a certificate program as well, and we are on the verge of having a master's degree, like 4+1 project degree with the college, with the College of Education. So could you say something about that? And I want to say also something, like maybe you also talk about it, is like a question of sustainability, etc. For instance, Laurel May Singh is, was hired for like sustainability, to develop sustainability courses and teach about sustainability and all of that, but also that all our courses have a sustainability, segment to it, or at least aspect of it is about sustainability. So could you say something about all of those things in like 2 minutes or less?
Yeah. The ethnic studies curriculum, the way in which we have grown has been to emphasize the place-based, ocean-based knowledge, which we have, which courses through many of the materials that we teach. This has just been an opportunity to lift that up because they also match the priorities that is being articulated at the university-wide level. Same with sustainability. I think that we have been leaders, and we were recognized yesterday as a department that has done a lot of thinking and work in the community around sustainability. And what this emphasis university-wide on sustainable futures and resilience is doing is to simply giving us a space to publicize the work that we do and to raise the visibility of our contribution to that curricular effort. We, in terms of the 4+1 program, one of the things that students often tell us is that it's hard for them to explain to their parents what ethnic studies does. Many of our students have gone on to become teachers, and this gives these students a way to say that, I have studied ethnic studies, I have understood the ways in which power and inequality operates in society, and more importantly, I know how to sort of correct those inequalities. And now I can go on for training into a professional school in order to go into the public education system and make a difference.
With a master's degree.
Yeah, with a master's degree.
Right. So 4+1 year, and you, an undergraduate work 1 year, and then you get a master's degree and you can teach. Yeah. So
and there are some very good institutional incentives which give students a tuition break while they're taking graduate courses as undergraduates.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So we flat out of time, but I want to also say, like, we also this past weekend, we had a retreat in which we looked at what things we have to do for the immediate future in ethnic studies, etc. Well, thank you all for coming over, and mahalo nui loa, and see you next month for featuring Ethnic Studies number 2. Aloha.